especially Shaquila and the entire Rafiki faculty and staff who have been so hospitable to us over the last few days. It is so good, friends, to be with you here in Nigeria. To be with you and to be in the homeland of that remarkable 18th century author and abolitionist, Oluta Ekwano, whose work I love, the 19th century translator and churchman Samuel Crowther, and one of my own colleagues at Eastern University, Ihuoma Nwachukwu, who is a celebrated and award-winning short story writer. So this is my first time in Nigeria, and I had breakfast with Ihuoma, and he told me to greet his native land. So, now as a fellow teacher, I am also so encouraged to be with you and count every one of you as colleagues in this good work to which God has called us. It's a good work to which God may still be calling some of you who are still learning about classical education. I mean, it might be that you're here because you suspect, like me, that this is one of the important ways God is extending his kingdom in Nigeria and maybe nurturing the next generation of Nigerians. Perhaps you're here because you're dissatisfied, like me as well, with merely modern education and the way it has reduced students and probably reduced many of us to economic producers or materialist consumers or political functionaries. Perhaps you feel that there's more to being human than that, more to human flourishing than merely modern education knows anything about. So perhaps you're here because you have a suspicion that if we could just clear away the rubble of merely modern education, we might find an even older and deeper and more stable set foundation beneath it. And we have it. It's called classical Christian education. And it, my friends, is a foundation set upon the bedrock of God's eternal work and his enduring word. A foundation reinforced by the accumulated wisdom and enduring works of the ages. And as I hope to show you, it's a foundation upon which God's people have been building schools and educating students since the very beginning of the church, whether in the watery crossroads of the Mediterranean, across Europe, North America, Asia, and Africa, whether in the 4th century, the 12th century, the 16th century, or now into the 21st century. I also hope to show you that while Africa was the birthplace of many good things in the history of the world, as we all know, it was also the birthplace of classical Christian education. And now through Rafiki, it seems like it's coming home. Now, you may be wondering, Dr. Williams, has the work of classical Christian education really been a work of the church since the beginning? I mean, isn't the church's work simply to save souls so that people go to heaven when they die? Well, no, not exactly. At least it's never limited its work to simply that. The great educator John Henry Newman rightly points out that everywhere the church has gone, it has built 3 buildings. You know what they are? Churches, to care for souls, hospitals, to care for bodies, and schools, to care for hearts, minds, and hands. Now, churches, hospitals, and schools may each have different primary gifts to give to people, but each one represents an important work of the church. Now, if this claim about the church and education surprises you, that's okay, because for a long time, I too was somewhat ignorant of the great tradition of the church. You see, I was trained as a biblical scholar first and theologian and ethicist afterwards. But soon after, I began teaching at a classical Christian school called Cair Paravel Latin School. I was delighted to discover that many of the churchmen and churchwomen and many of the theologians that I knew as theologians were also, or were really, classroom teachers. They were school headmasters. They were homeschoolers. They were academic administrators. They were wardens of boarding schools, and they were teachers of teachers. They were educators who fought curricular battles. They prepared lesson plans for children and teenagers. They struggled to find time to read and write on their own. But as Christians, they were committed to education as the holistic formation of human persons for the sake of lifelong and eternal flourishing. Now, these educators and men and women of the church that I discovered in the course of teaching at Cair Paravel Latin School. They include men and women like Clement of Alexandria, Egypt, and Origen, and Cyprian, and Augustine, early church fathers and classical educators here on the African continent, as well as Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil of Caesarea in Asia Minor in modern Turkey. There was the 6th century Boethius in Rome, the homeschooling mother Duoda, one of my favorites, who in the 7th century wrote a handbook of spiritual formation for her teenage son. Something no less relevant today than it was, I'm sure, in the 6th and 7th century. There's the 10th century playwriting nun Pratsvita, who wrote Christian plays modeled on the Carthaginian poet Terence. There's the 12th century Hugh of St. Victor, Thomas Aquinas, the great 15th century author and educator Christine de Pizan, all in Paris. There was the 8th century Alcuin, John Wycliffe, John Henry Newman in England. There was Philip Melanchthon and Martin Luther in Wittenberg, Germany. There was John Calvin in Geneva, Jan Comenius in Poland. You're getting the idea, I hope. There was the Anglican John Colet, the 18th century Methodist evangelist John Wesley, who wrote an entire classical Christian curriculum for the Kingswood School that served the poorest of the poor in Bristol, England. For you Baptists out there was William Carey, who established a classical Christian school in India. There was a 20th century C.S. Lewis, as well as my own teacher and mentor, J.I. Packer, and so on and so on. You get the idea. It doesn't matter if you're hearing some of the names of these educational fathers and mothers for the first time. What matters is that we see that as the church expanded in both space and time, it always included a deep and abiding concern for what we now call classical Christian education. You see, and to this short list could be added thousands more whose names are not recorded, whose names we don't know. You know why? Because they poured their energy and their life and their time into teaching students rather than into writing books, pouring their lives into the formation of the students that sat in their classrooms, like all of us, and who had no idea, while they were doing that good work, the kind of impact that work would have in the lives of their students and in the generations that followed them, in the families their students created, in the cultures they went on to curate, in the businesses and communities and nations they would form. But that, I think, is what faith is all about. Faithfully attending to the good work that God has set before us, even though you have no idea how God may use it in the decades to come. This seems to be, as I read his story, how Olaolu Ekwano approached the writing of his marvelous autobiography, the son of Nigeria that many of you may know. He wrote his work, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaolu Ekwano, in the 18th century, published in 1789, which is full of both Christian conviction and classical references to philosophy, literature, math, and science. If you don't know this book, you should go read it, but he was an Igbo child captured as a slave, taken back and forth across the Atlantic to England multiple times, fell in love with my city, Philadelphia, because there he met some pretty wonderful abolitionist Christian Quakers, eventually embraced the Christian faith, fought his way to freedom against all odds, became a businessman, sailed as an explorer on the ship that made it closest to the North Pole than any other ship at that time. Several times compared himself to the wandering and suffering Odysseus in Homer's story, The Odyssey, and finally drew upon the classical pattern of ethos, logos, and pathos to write his eloquent autobiography. What he didn't know at the time was that one day he would be asked to present part of that work to the Queen of England, nor that he would partner with the abolitionists' work around William Wilberforce, nor that 10 years after his death, in part because of his story, England would pass the Slave Trade Act in 1807, which outlawed slavery in the British Empire. He also had no idea that the Slave Trade Act would authorize the British warship, the Myrmidon, named after the fighting army of Odysseus' friend Achilles from the Iliad. No lie, this ship was called the Myrmidon. In 1821, to raid another Portuguese slave ship and free a little 12-year-old boy on that ship named Samuel Crowther. Samuel Crowther was freed, and you might know his story. He went on to be one of the most important African churchmen of the 19th century, the first African Anglican bishop, and the most significant African Bible translator in the history of the church to that time. Because he learned Latin, and Greek, and Yoruba, and Igbo, and Hausa, and Nupe, and he did all that to translate the Bible. His work eventually earned him an honorary doctorate from my institution, the University of Oxford. But before all that, there was Aquano, reading scripture, philosophy, mathematics, literature, living faithfully as a Christian, doing the work God put in front of him, having no idea the impact his humble work would eventually have upon an entire nation, then upon Samuel Crowther, then through him, upon the church back in Nigeria, and possibly upon many of you sitting in this room. See, his story is one important example of the way that all of us ought to approach our vocation in classical Christian education. We may never see the full benefits of the work we're doing, just like Aquano, and just like hundreds of thousands of other teachers in this long tradition into which God has called us. So, okay, I've claimed that classical Christian education has been a work of the church since its beginning. I've named a couple dozen Christian educators whose names some of you may recognize. To start. And now perhaps some of you are wondering if these people just wrote about education or if they were really classroom teachers. Right? If they just theorized about it or if they actually did it. And as we know, there's a difference. And it's a fair question. So let me emphasize that these people whose names I just mentioned really were classroom, hands-on teachers, not just book-writing theorists. There was the great Reformation theologian, he'll come up in a second, the great Reformation theologian Philip Melanchthon, who wrote the first systematic theology of the Reformation, but was also called the Preceptor Germaniae, the teacher of Germany. And I love this. He wrote a speech one time and delivered it to his faculty, and you know what it was called? On the Misery of Teachers. Nobody writes that who hasn't been a teacher. And he once passed statutes intended to discipline students, quote, who disrupt study, disobey the head teacher, gamble, party in the night, break into houses, instigate fights, visit prostitutes, and indulge in whatever the 16th century version of immodest dancing was. But as a dean, I think I've handled I've handled all but one of those issues. And probably the one I haven't handled yet actually happened. I just didn't learn about it. But here's Melanchthon, clearly a classroom teacher. There's also this guy, 12th century educator Hugh of St. Victor, who references students at rest in their own sluggishness, who wrinkle their noses at lectures, and who break out in angry condemnation of anything they don't understand. He counsels them that they should learn with all humility and they shouldn't look down on learning from any man who has something to teach them. So he knew students, but he also knew teachers. He warns teachers not to overwhelm our students with unrelated theories or ideas that confuse them more than edify them. He says that teachers, and some of you who were just in my last workshop, you should wonder if I've learned this. He says we teachers should not say everything we could say so that we don't say less profitably what we should say. I'm probably not the only teacher in this room who recognizes either his students or himself in these comments from our pedagogical forebears, which is comforting. It's also comforting and encouraging to read this letter from the great Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest Christian scholar of the Renaissance, who once wrote to his discouraged teacher friend John Vitz. He writes, "To be a schoolmaster is next to being a king," or in Shaquila's case, a queen. "Do you count it lowly employment to imbue the minds of the young with the things of Christ and the best of literature, and return them to their homes honest and virtuous persons? In the opinion of fools, it may be a humble task, but in fact, it is the noblest of occupations. Listen to this. No one does more for one's country than a man who shapes its unformed young people, provided he himself is learned and honorable." I'll take that. 400 years after Erasmus, another classical Christian educator and theologian, John Henry Newman, echoes the significance of teachers in the lives of schools and students and cultures, and he writes this: "The general principles of any study you may learn from books at home. But the detail, the color, the tone, the air, the life which makes it lives in us, you must catch all those from those in whom it lives already. We must come to the teachers of wisdom to learn wisdom. We must repair to the fountains, ad fontes, and drink there. Portions of it may go from there to the ends of the earth by means of books, but the fullness is in one place alone, and that's in the teacher, in the classroom, in the school. Now, if I can, let me draw your attention to one of those phrases. That's the phrase made most famous in the Renaissance, to the fountain. The Latin is ad fontes. Now, in the Renaissance, repairing to the fountain meant returning to the important books. To Plato, to Aristotle, to Sappho or Seneca, Aquinas or Calvin, but to local classroom teachers as sources and fountains of wisdom. Contemporary teachers like you and like me. See, because even though Plato and Augustine, Dante and Calvin have good gifts to give our students, we have gifts to give our students that they can't give them. They can give them some gifts we can't. We can give them some gifts they can't. And what is that? It is a living embodiment in space and time of an ordinary person living the classical Christian tradition. Not just reading about it and not just teaching it, but living the classical Christian tradition in their midst and becoming for our students deep wells. Deep wells that nourish their intellectually and spiritually parched souls. This matters. This matters because classical education has never simply been about passing on knowledge and skills. Let me say that again. Classical Christian education has never been simply about passing on knowledge and skills, but about passing on a way of life. A classical Christian way of living. A way of living a fully integrated human life. And that requires students to see living models. Only by offering ourselves as models of classical Christian living in our contemporary secular times will students, their families, and our cultures catch the detail, the color, the tone, the air, and the life that breathes in and through this tradition. This is why this guy, Lawrence of Westminster, left England back in the 12th century to study with Hugh of St. Victor in Paris. He writes home, just like any of us would. Maybe not so eloquently, when I write letters at least. He says, with all possible dispatch, I chose this excellent and unique teacher, and I embraced his teaching with supreme diligence, since the moral excellence of his life decorates his learning. Isn't that a lovely phrase? I hope my students say some version of that about me. The moral excellence of his life decorates his learning. And the saintliness of this teacher illuminates his polished teaching with beauty of manners. This is why Christine de Pizan, when she reflected on the kind of people we need as classical teachers, writes this. One ought to provide a tutor who is wise and prudent more in morals than in lofty learning. I like this though. Yet, it would be much more praiseworthy to find a perfect one who is a notable scholar as well. This great combination, that's what we see in the tradition. This is because the tradition into which we've been called, friends, has a master and apprentice model of education. The Greeks called this mimesis, learning by imitation. This is Christ saying a disciple will be like his master. This is St. Paul telling Timothy, follow me as I follow Christ. This is incarnate pedagogy, or in another wonderful phrase from John Henry Newman, it is a rhetoric of conduct. You see, as I told my workshop this morning, classical teachers need to be the kind of people we want our students to become. It means as classical teachers, we offer our own lives as part of the curriculum, and we offer our students water from our own wells, which have been dug deep into the groundwaters of the tradition through reading and prayer, study and worship, wonder and devotion, so the waters of that tradition can bubble up and flow into our wells and bubble up and overflow into the lives of our students. That's what it means to be part of this tradition. All right. I hope you're beginning to see the church has always focused on education, that this education attends to the holistic formation of students, and that the churchmen and churchwomen that were in this tradition were real classroom teachers who taught and lived the tradition. At this point, maybe you're convinced of that, but maybe now you're wondering, okay, I get that. What's this classical part? Where does the classical part of classical Christian education come from? Well, let me tell you my own story. When I was discovering the long tradition, I was also surprised to find that many of the theologians I had been reading, not only were they teachers, but when they taught both Christianity and classical literature, theology and the liberal arts, the gospel and Greek tragedy, piety and philosophy, Seneca and scripture. Now, why? Well, because very early in its history, the church, especially North Africans like Origen, Augustine, Cyprian, Clement, and Athanasius, inherited and then transformed the philosophy, history, literature, arts, and sciences of the two great Mediterranean cultures at the heart of the classical tradition, Greece and Rome. The early church did this because it found in these two Mediterranean cultures tools and insights and books and ideas and works of art that clearly grew out of the God-given image and the humanity of the Greeks and Romans. They found that these ideas and tools and works of art were useful for discovering the true and doing the good and making the beautiful and even in some cases worshiping the holy. And they recognized that some of these tools and ideas and books and insights could help other people do the same. And so Christian educators, especially in North Africa, brought the best of these two Mediterranean traditions into dialogue with the Jewish and Christian scriptures and the Jewish and Christian tradition in order to properly locate those truths and insights within salvation history and therefore transform them. Now, I think our church fathers and mothers were encouraged to do this by this guy, this Middle Eastern, this Jew named St. Paul, who exhorted his readers to do this. He says, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, worthy of our love, admirable, virtuous, and praiseworthy, whatever you find that falls into those categories, do what? Think about it. Then he follows that with, whatever you have learned or received or heard from me, including the statement I just made about thinking about those things, what? Put it into practice. Thinking and practicing whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, virtuous, and praiseworthy is not a bad summary of classical Christian education and classical Christian living. Now, in order to describe this activity, early church fathers came up with lots of metaphors to try to explain and answer the question that we have, okay, where does this classical bit come from, and how does it fit in with the Christian part of classical Christian education? So, again, North African St. Augustine writes this. He says, well, one way we can think about this is if we take the metaphor of Israel leaving Egypt. And one of the things that happened when Israel left Egypt was that the Egyptians seemed compelled to give the Israelites their gold and their silver as they were heading out of the country through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. And what did the Israelites do with that gold and silver and jewels? They made the tabernacle. And eventually, they made the temple. And so St. Augustine says, that's kind of like what we're doing with the Mediterranean traditions of Greece and Rome. We're taking the treasures, we're taking the good things, and we're using them in the Christian tradition, just as the Israelites used Egyptian gold and silver to create the tabernacle and eventually the temple. Other Christian educators like Clement of Alexandria, Egypt, and Rabanus Maurus of Germany, they abandoned this metaphor of what Augustine called plundering the Egyptians, because they said, well, we're not really plundering them if that implies we're stealing from them. Because they point out that just because it was non-Christians who discovered some of these truths and insights in the first place, it wasn't like the non-Christians owned those truths and insights. They didn't own beauty. They didn't own deep understanding of the world and human creatures, because they said, no, those things belong to God. And so we're not plundering or stealing from them because they didn't own them in the first place. It might have been that God used them as human persons made in his image to discover some of these things for the first time, just like God might use a scientist or a physicist or a linguist or a neuroscientist to discover certain things now. And they said, you know what, God allowed those people to discover some of those things so that through them God could bless all people, whether they were Christian or not. Now, what needed to happen, though, is that Basil, again of Caesarea and Asia Minor and Turkey, he counseled. He said, that's true, but we do need to be discriminating. We do need to think about the things that we inherited from the Greco-Roman tradition, and we need to think about how we're receiving them. And he comes up with a wonderful metaphor that then gets taken up and developed by Christians throughout the centuries. And he says, this practice of the Christian sorting and sifting and selecting of the goodness from the tradition, he said it's kind of like bees making honey. And he says this. He says bees don't approach all the flowers equally, nor in truth do they attempt to carry off the entire flower. Instead, bees take only so much from the flower as is necessary for their work, and the rest they leave untouched. See, like Augustine and Basil and centuries of theologians, I might learn, as I have, from Aristotle's teaching on virtue, but I might reject Aristotle's teaching on God, because he didn't know the incarnate triune God of grace. So Basil writes, the wise student will appropriate from this literature what is suitable to us and akin to the truth, and will pass over the rest. He says, just as in plucking the blooms from a rosebud we avoid the thorns, so in gathering what is useful from these writings, let us guard against what is harmful. Last year, Robin and I were in Kenya, and we went to one of those beautiful tea farms, and we saw hundreds of people picking tea. And weren't they doing the exact same thing? They weren't picking every leaf from the tea plants. They were picking only the best ones. That would brew one day a nourishing cup of tea. The ones that weren't good, they just let fall to the ground and wither. 900 years after Basil, this remarkable 12th century woman, Herod of Landsberg, author of this beautiful encyclopedia called The Garden of Delights, she picks up his metaphor of bees, and she says this: like a little bee inspired by God, I collected from the various flowers of Scripture and the philosophic writings, I collected this book called The Garden of Delights. And I brought it together to the praise and honor of Christ and the church for the sake of your love, as if into a single sweet honeycomb. Therefore, in this book, you ought diligently to seek pleasing food and to refresh your exhausted soul with its honeyed dewdrops. She creates this amazing image that our schools, many of our schools have up on their walls and is used in classrooms. And it's an image to show how the 7 liberal arts and the philosophers Plato and Aristotle nurtured the love of wisdom. In the center of this picture, there's philosophy, shown as a woman. And for her, this philosophy, in small writing, it says, is the Philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ. Now, for me, this is a wonderful image, but I think it also helps us describe and understand not only people from the history of the church, but think back into the Old Testament. You remember the description of Moses in Egypt? One of the things it describes Moses doing is learning Egyptian history and literature and philosophy and medicine and languages. And it seems like he did so without feeling like that learning corrupted his Jewish faithfulness. One of my favorite stories is Daniel 1. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taken into Babylon. And sometimes what we focus on is their rejection of the king's meat and wine. Right? Remember this? Because it seemed like they thought that was going to corrupt them. You know what they didn't think was going to corrupt them and what they accepted readily? 3 years in Babylonian University. It says they spent 3 years learning the language and the history and the science of the Babylonians. It seemed like that was okay to do without, again, violating their Jewish faithfulness. There's also Paul and Apollos. Paul, who quotes from Greek poets. Apollos, clearly well-educated. Now, this story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I find so fascinating because I think their experience really mirrors the experience of the early church, trying to receive the Greco-Roman tradition and transform it in a Christian way, just as they were receiving the Babylonian tradition of education and transforming it in a Jewish way. This is a little painting that I commissioned an artist down in Texas to do for me a couple years ago, where I had him layer on those three characters are the three men in Daniel 1, but if you look carefully, you can tell how each of them are pursuing the 7 liberal arts. You'll see grammar, logic, and rhetoric there down at the bottom. The middle guy pursuing music, the guy on the left pursuing astronomy, and the guy on the right doing arithmetic and geometry. And you'll see what's around that picture. I don't know if you can see it. It's plants with bees. And there are little bees and little quotes there from the church fathers, because I think that's not only, again, the metaphor for what we see the early church doing, it's what we see our Old Testament forebears doing, and I think, again, it's our model in this long tradition. Now, this decision of Basil and others to immerse themselves like this is not unique. A couple other examples, just to make my point. Augustine, from modern Algeria, planned to write 7 books on each of the seven liberal arts. Unfortunately, he says, I loaned some of these books out and never got them back. I mean, if that's not evidence that he's a real teacher, I don't know what is, right? How many times does that happen to us? Aquinas wrote commentaries on Aristotle. John Calvin, the great Reformation theologian, his first book was on Seneca. Philip Melanchthon, the first systematic theologian of the Reformation, also wrote commentaries on Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, Ovid, Homer, and so forth. Again, my own mentor, J.I. Packer, his first degree was in classics. The great black classical educators, Arnold Julian Cooper and William Sanders Scarborough, taught Greek and Latin. Martin Luther King Jr. in the U.S., who said that if he ever got stranded on a desert island, he wanted 2 books, the Bible and Plato's Republic. Because he said everything there is possibly to think about is contained in those 2 works. So, this is something the church has always done. Its people were real educators. It focused on the holistic formation of students. And from the beginning, it was classical Christian. Now, let me share one more piece of this. And let me substantiate my earlier claim that classical Christian education was one of the gifts this continent gave to the church. You see, it's possible this tradition never would have started. But as I've already hinted, it was a debate on African soil that first provided the foundations of this long tradition. I'll say this one more time. Classical Christian education was a gift given to the church primarily by African Christians and secondarily by Christians of Asia Minor. It's not an American import. It's not a European import. Instead, it's homegrown. Because this continent was its cradle and its crib. And through the work of Rafiki, it seems like this long-lost child who went off into the far country is finally coming home. And the only reason it didn't come further south earlier was a simple geographical accident, an anomaly of the Sahara Desert, which stopped literally both the Roman Empire and the church from expanding south because they found it easier to go north. Now, one of these great African fathers, Clement, defended classical Christian education in the 3rd century in this way. He said, before the Lord's coming, philosophy was an essential guide to the Greeks. Your foot will not stumble, Christians, if you attribute good things, Greek or Christian, to providence. He says, God's responsible for all good things. All good things come from above. Some, like the blessings of the Old and New Covenants, directly, others, like the riches of philosophy, indirectly. He says, truth is one. Everything is illuminated when the true light arises, so all who stretched out towards the truth, Greeks and non-Greeks, could be shown to possess some portion of the truth. You see, what I want you to see is not only the start on African soil, but this debate means that the classical Christian tradition is a capacious tradition that is theologically driven to accept to accept new insights, new discoveries, new scientific insights, new inventions, new works of art, new works of literature, and to bring them into this larger conversation. This conversation that has stretched back over 2,000 years now. This conversation that, again, grew out of African soil means that all of us in this longer tradition, including myself, can trace our intellectual lineage back to these early men from North Africa. Okay. Classical Christian education is something the church has always done. Its writers and theologians were real teachers. They lived the tradition. They focused on holistic formation. And from its early days, it has been classical Christian. Now, before I end with a compelling work of art found in one of the most important churches in Christendom, let me address one final question you may have. You may accept the church has always done this, but you may ask, why? Why has the church always done this? Well, the church, it seems, has always done this, as I hinted at, because it aligns so closely with the church's mission to preserve, protect, and promote holistic human flourishing. The flourishing of individuals and their cultures from the anti-creation and anti-human effects of sin. Those anti-creation, anti-human forces that are ravaging the children and the society of Nigeria and the United States and Kenya, and that cause the confusion and despair that we see in so many of our students, that I see in my university students, that Ken Mbuga was talking about this morning, because students are looking for fulfillment in things that simply won't fulfill them. And so the church has recognized that humans need to be nurtured and flourish in the 7 areas that I'm unpacking in my workshop: intellectually, morally, aesthetically, spiritually, physically, practically, and socially. You see, this emerges from the biblical belief that the love we are called to demonstrate to our neighbors is not limited to just one dimension of our neighbors. Their neighbors have bodies, don't they? They need to be cared for. They're physical creatures who suffer. Our neighbors are people who are designed to work. They're moral agents who act, and they need guidance on how to do that. They're intellectual creatures who think and know. They're artistic creatures who make like their creating Father. They're affective creatures who love and feel and desire. Finally, spiritual creatures created for community with our God. They're social creatures called to contribute to the common good of their cultures. So the church has said, you know what? Classical Christian education is one great but ordinary way the church has long loved its neighbors. Loved its neighbors by helping them order every aspect of their life, their loves, their labors, their learning, under the lordship of the God who made them. Now, I think it's thrilling to see how this tradition has nurtured this open conversation. This conversation about, as St. Paul said, whatever, if you will, is true, good, beautiful, and holy. And this conversation has now expanded, yes, across Europe, North America, and certainly is expanding across the African continent, again, through the good work of Rafiki. And yes, I quote Augustine and Melanchthon and Newman because they're my colleagues in this work. And I quote Robin Burlew because she's my colleague in this work. And soon I think I'll be quoting my new friend and brother Ken Mbuga, who's my friend in this work. And Shakila, and Sunday Agong, and others I haven't met yet. Because that's part of the great conversation across space and time that we are caught up in and we are introducing our students into. Now, let me illustrate this. I am a great lover of art, and art is so instructive to me. Let me illustrate this by taking you into a room at the heart of one of the most important churches in the history of the church. There's a room in the center of the Vatican in Rome. Very important church in the history of the church, and it's called the Stanza della Segnatura, my Italian's poor. And there we find 4 frescoes from the 15th century on 4 facing walls, silently dialoguing with one another about what I'm going to say is classical Christian education. Let me show you. Here's the first one. This is called the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament. Now, this is the one you might expect to find in a church. It draws theologians and poets and churchmen from across time into one animated scene. There's piles of recently consulted books falling off the steps. One of my favorite is St. Augustine there. He's got his finger stuck in a book, and he's got another one on his lap. That's the kind of guy he was. There's Boethius, Aquinas, Dante, Ambrose, Gregory the Great, Bonaventure, and others. And this whole company is debating one single question. And it's a question about the nature of the Eucharistic sacrament, of communion there in the middle, and the incarnation of Christ. Above them, you see the triune God and the host of heaven observing the debate and engaging in their own conversation, probably about the incarnation, and then overlooking this whole scene. So that's one of the pictures, and that represents the holy. That represents the church conversing with itself about the holy. Now, there's another wall, and it's called Mount Parnassus. And here the scene centers around not Christ, but Apollo, who is the god of the muses and literature and music and dance. And here we see him surrounded by the 9 muses, and beyond them, poets from antiquity to the Renaissance. There's Homer, and Homer is flanked by Virgil and Dante in conversation behind his back for some reason. He was blind, and maybe he didn't know they were there. There's Sappho, and Ovid, and Horace, and across from them there's Petrarch, and Boccaccio, and Ariosto, all locked in lively exchange about poetry, the arts, and beauty. So one wall, focusing on what's holy. One, conversing about beauty. Now, there's another one that I see around the corner, actually, in the Rice building, in the Rice hallway right here. This is called the School of Athens. In this one, we see in the very center, we see Plato and Aristotle locked in conversation. Aristotle carries his ethics, Plato cradles his Timaeus, and they have a debate about where to find truth and where to find goodness. Interesting about this picture, you see what's in the very center of the picture? It's kind of Plato and Aristotle, but actually the very center is the space between them, where that conversation is taking place. It's actually that gap right there. Now, around the room, other philosophers who represent the 7 liberal arts and other philosophies. There's Ptolemy and Averroes and Pythagoras for you mathematicians, and Euclid is there, and Socrates is there, and they are debating whatever, justice and goodness and truth. And in this room, we've seen the holy, we've seen the beautiful, and here they're debating the true. The true, the holy, the beautiful. We're just missing one. The good. So in this scene, above the doorway, we see 7 virtues represented. We see the central human virtues: courage, justice, temperance, and prudence. And next to them, supporting them, helping them, we see the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Because as the painter knew, the virtues work together. So courage is there holding an oak branch with a lion, and charity is with her, so that we develop courageous love. And prudence is there with 2 faces looking within a mirror, and hope is there holding a torch, helping her see into the future so that she has hopeful prudence. Temperance is there holding reins that rein in our desires, accompanied by faith, so that we have faithful temperance or faithful self-control. And above them, in a little tondo on the top, is justice, looking down with the scales of justice and righteousness. So in this room, we see a debate going on that's gone on in the history of the church about the true, the good, the beautiful, and the holy. A classical Christian debate. And this represents much of the tradition that we're a part of. Now, one question you might have is, well, wait a second. Why isn't John Calvin or Karl Barth or Bishop Tudu there? Why isn't John Milton or Jane Austen or Aluda Ekwano or Chinua Achebe painted with the writers? Or Copernicus or Kepler among the philosophers? Why not? Because they don't belong? Because they're being excluded? Nah, they just haven't been born yet. Because in this tradition, this great conversation, it's always welcome new people to the table. No matter where they came from, no matter who they were, it welcomes them to the tradition anytime they meet them and find them. Now, one final note I'll just make about this room is that notice these aren't 4 separate rooms. These are not 4 separate discourses. This is one discourse the church and educators are having with themselves. And you may have noticed there was one character who showed up in 2 of the frescoes, and that was Dante Alighieri, the great Christian poet. He shows up with the poets and the theologians. Because Dante represents the kind of integration we hope for. This room represents the kind of integration that we hope for in our schools and in our students. All right, friends. One final thought and conclusion about this long story that we've been caught up in. Let me carry on with the notion of carrying forward. Because we don't just carry the conversation forward for the decades of our life on earth. The tradition of classical Christian education and classical Christian living teaches us that when we engage in this work and when we converse about the real, the human, and the holy things that endure, when we make Christian honey from a diverse field of flowers, as we do that, we lean into eschatological glory and taste in advance what it will be like to wonder and learn and love and worship in the new heavens and the new earth. You see, when we enter the new heavens and the new earth, we will not be less than fully human. We may be more than fully human, but we will not be less than fully human. So the kinds of things that delight us now will delight us then. The kind of good things we participate in now are like anticipations of the good things that we will participate in there. Look what these theologians and these educators tell us. There's Hugh of St. Victor, who describes the activity of learning as providing a foretaste of the sweetness of the eternal quiet. Isidore of Seville, that through a life of study, Christians may live now in a manner that resembles the life of their future home. Cassiodorus, that the wisdom learned from studying labor now is a glorious and eternal attainment. Aquinas, that the contemplative life begins here in order to be made perfect in the life to come. Melanchthon refers to learning someday in the eternal academy. Joseph Pieper describes the contemplative mode as the foretaste and beginning of perfect eschatological joy. One of the songs that we sang this morning described the triumphant church eventually being at rest. You know what the Greek word for rest is? Skole. You know what word comes from skole? School. I love that. Even that song we sang this morning, there's a hint that when we are at leisure and rest in the eternal quiet, we will be at rest pursuing leisure and pursuing learning and pursuing delight in all the things that God has made and given us to enjoy. This means that what was going on in the schools scattered throughout the history of classical Christian education, and what you do in your schools scattered over various African countries, and what we do in our schools scattered across North America is no trifling thing, folks. The work of the classical Christian teacher is no trifling vocation. It's no low calling. Instead, to summarize, it's work the church has always done. It attends to the holistic formation of our students. It aligns with the mission and mandate from God. And our cultures always have and always will need it, and it seems like it may be something we find ourselves doing for all eternity. And I, for one, am looking forward to doing that with all of you. In the meantime, though, we've got some work to do, so we might as well get after it. And I think that if the Africans, Clement, Augustine, Cyprian, and Origen, the Europeans, Hugh, Herod, Melanchthon, and others in this long tradition could see what we're trying to do in the United States, could see what you're doing in Nigeria, could see what Rafiki's doing across Africa, they would recognize it as a common work, in common with their work. And they would ask God to use it for the common good of the church and the world He calls us to love. So we join our efforts with your efforts and with their efforts to revive this great tradition of classical Christian education and make it available to our children and our children's children and our nation's children and the world's children so that they can do the work God created them to do and pursue a lifetime and eventually an eternity of standing still and learning to be astonished, of loving one another, of worshiping the gracious God who made us, called us to this good work, and will one day call us home with the words, "Well done, good and faithful teachers." So blessings upon you and your work, my friends, and if on this earth we don't see you again before we leave, we'll simply look forward to taking our place alongside you in the someday coming eternal academy of Christ our teacher. Thank you.